Hi, welcome back. Tom Bartels from growfoodwell.com. I'm going to turn this compost today. I've got 4 bins. They've been here, a little over a month and a half, I guess. And this is how to get a really good compost pile so that when you do end up with your compost in the spring or whatever season you're doing this, it's all pretty uniformly broken down by the bacteria. That's what this is all about. So today, I'm going to go ahead and take the covers off. You want to make sure you cover your compost pile because you want to be able to control the moisture and the aeration. If it gets too wet in there, you stop the composting process. It gets all slimy. So I cover it with burlap so that it doesn't dry out, which is another way to stop a compost pile. Too wet, too dry. So I've got that one going to 100 degrees. I don't want to disturb it because it's still pretty active. It looks like 120. I have a sticky thermometer there, but so it's at 120. It's still fairly active. I don't want to disturb that pile, so I'm going to leave it until it breaks down a little further. So I'll be working with these 3 bins here today. I'm going to leave that hot one alone, and it will reinvigorate the pile so that it breaks down a lot more material, and consequently the resultant reaction is you see an increase in the heat. So you can just track it with a thermometer, and it basically tells you how much activity is taking place in that pile, and it'll stay 24 hours a day at that heat level for weeks on end as this bacteria breaks down the material. So you can really tell how active a compost pile is strictly by heat alone, and you can keep track of that with one of these handy compost thermometers, which is a really, really good investment if you're going to be doing compost at all, just to know what that temperature is. Because when it flatlines and it's no longer doing anything, you want to know that so that you can come in and change the material or fold it in on itself so that it can start working it for you again. So I'm going to pull the gates on these. And on the sides of this pile are going to be the least processed materials. As you dig closer to the center of the pile where all the bacteria intensity was taking place, that's going to be the good stuff in the center. So we're going to take this exterior stuff and reconstitute the pile with that. And this then will become food for the bacteria that's still alive in there but not very active. It's important to keep moisture and oxygen in your pile. If it gets too compressed, like it does over time, that can slow down the biological activity quite a bit. And also if it gets too dry and it runs out of moisture, that'll slow down the activity. It needs both moisture and oxygen to break down the material. So that's why you have to turn the pile, a couple times, sometimes 3 times, depending on what the materials are in that pile and how active it is. And you'll find that different materials will break down at different speeds. So I've got this bin emptied and out, and just by that very activity, I've fluffed it up, reinitiated some oxygen. You'll find that typically in the middle of your pile, you'll have material that is really broken down a whole different level. And so that's why we're going to turn this pile to bring it all into that level. So just look for that in your compost pile and see how well that material is breaking down. You should, about midway in the pile, find a definite hotter area where most of the heat is generated because it's insulated from the sides, it's got enough moisture to start out with and a lot of bacteria and a lot of carbon material, and that's where most of the activity takes place. If you just leave it alone, you're going to have this really nicely broken down center part of the pile, and then your stuff on the sides is going to be much like you put it in whenever you did. It'll be broken down a little bit, but nothing near what the center is. So that's why we're bringing this all back into the middle to get it all to that level. So now I've got all the compost out. I'm starting to reload it and incorporate some air in there and mix up the materials a little bit. And it's really important as you're doing this to have a hose handy, even if it's winter. It's December 3rd today, and we got a storm system coming in, so I wanted to get this done before the storm hit. But it's important to put that water in there, especially since a lot of this dried out that was in the hotter center of the pile. you want to make sure this is kind of like a wrung out sponge when it's re-layered like this. There's some of that dry stuff. So we're trying to incorporate some fresh and some composted material into the pile, so it's not the same layers, it's mixed up a little bit, and that'll help break it down. And you'll notice that as you remake this pile and incorporate some air into there, which is what we're doing with this space, it's going to fluff it back up and it's going to fill the bin again, or at least most of it. Each successive turning, it'll make the pile that much smaller because your pieces are getting broken down into smaller and smaller particles. So okay, so now I've got all that compost replaced back into the bins. It's been aerated and kind of scrambled a little bit so that the compost that was broken down is now mixed in with the stuff that isn't. And on the top of these compost bins, I put about 8-10 inches of leaves, and I typically do that to just kind of insulate the pile in the wintertime especially, so that it doesn't dissipate its heat too quickly. And on each one of these bins, I usually put a piece of old burlap that you can get from most coffee stores or places that have coffee in general. And I just put these on top to kind of keep the moisture from dissipating too quickly. Also keeps it from sunlight. You don't want your compost piles directly in the sunlight because they dry out too fast. So these are in the shade to begin with. I also put the corrugated steel over the top because when it starts snowing, I don't want too much moisture in here and the pile will get too soggy. And I'm going to take my compost thermometer, put it right down into the center of one of those piles, and we'll come back in 3 or 4 days and check that temperature. Right now, it's so locked off about 45 degrees, 50 degrees, somewhere in there. And I think it'll be a lot warmer in about 4 days, so we'll come back and check that. So I probably won't turn these again until late winter. These will be broken down quite a bit by then. I'll turn them one more time. They'll get a little bit hotter for 3 weeks or so, and they'll be ready for spring planting. So that's how you turn your compost pile, and you want to make sure you incorporate that water, that oxygen, and a little bit of new material. Insulate the top so that it holds the heat. Welcome back. It's December 8th, and this compost has been sitting for about 4.5 to 5 days since we turned it, and in that time period we had a pretty good storm, had about 4 inches of snow, and the nighttime lows have been in the single digits. Today I think the high is 16 degrees, maybe 18 degrees. So I'm going to check in on the compost and see how it's doing and see if those microorganisms have been reinvigorated and they're doing their job. So first off, I'm going to get these covers off. One of the misconceptions of beginning composters is that you need ambient heat in order to get the pile going and that you can't do it in the wintertime. Here's a good example where we turned this pile 4 or 5 days ago. It was winter and it got very cold shortly after we turned it into the single digits multiple days in a row. And the ambient temperature right now is about 18 degrees. The temperature of the pile is 120 and climbing. So there's 100 degrees of difference between the ambient temperature and what's going on in this pile. That's strictly due to the bacterial and microorganism activity breaking down all this organic material. So it shows that it's the components inside the pile that create the heat. It's generated as a side effect of the process of breaking down that material. So it's just a good thing to remember that you can turn this compost in the middle of the winter and get it reheated again. So keep that in mind. If you do have a compost pile that's it was a rough pile in the fall and it was sitting and you haven't done anything with it early winter, if the snow's not too deep and you can get to your pile, it's really worthwhile to turn it because this is going to break down considerably more than it would have if I just left it all winter. So that's it for now. Go out and turn some compost and see what kind of heat you can generate, not only in yourself, but in that bin. It'll be great for your garden. Thanks for joining me on growfoodwell.com.